Hey guys, what's up? So, please excuse how I look, besides the scruffiness, but also I'm kind of tired. It's been it's been a long few days, and I spent at least yesterday kind of recuperating, but I have a lot on my plate right now, both YouTube wise and real life wise, and I'm still feeling a little off, but I really need to get my ass in gear. I have videos, including this one, that should have already been done already and posted up in freaking June, and now we're about to jump into July. In fact, at the time of this recording, it actually is July because it just crossed over into midnight. So please forgive me for that, but do my best to try to pump these out as fast as I can. So anyway, as you could tell by the title, we're going to be doing yet another sword review. Once again, this is a piece by LK Chen. Yes, it does seem like they seem to be the only guys who I'm reviewing, but it's only because they are kind enough to send me pieces. Mine is a very small channel, so it's not as if people are kicking down my door asking me to review swords. And not only that, but the Chinese sword market is a rather small one. So, yeah, there really aren't many companies that are going to be like, yo, can you test this one out? You can test this. Most of the time I have to go buy my own pieces. So it's nice that they, I guess because of my other reviews, I tend to be fair and as unbiased as I possibly can. It's really nice of them to send me these pieces, and I do appreciate it quite a bit. I do plan on. There's at least one other sword that I'm planning on buying actually that I'm going to be reviewing soon. And while it's been on the market for a while, I really think I owe it a review. But for now, I'm reviewing this. And this one, as you can tell by the title, is the Frontier Tang Dao. Now, what I need to get into with this particular piece is, even though this is already being sold on the website as of now, this particular piece I'm holding in my hand is a prototype. I want to stress that because there are going to be some things that I'm going to be mentioning about this that I've been told no longer really correspond with the one on the site. That being said, this is pretty much what they're selling anyway, with just one or two little things here and there that tend to be worked on. But this is the piece I got, and so this is the one that I'm going to be reviewing. I'm going to do my best to be as fair as possible, even though I do like the company and I've been happy with their products so far overall. You guys probably know from my sword reviews that when I review these things, I pull no punches. If I see something that I don't like or I see something that's a problem, I'm going to point it out. But I try my best to be fair, and especially if it's a company that I like, then I tend to be a little bit harder. Mostly because if I love it, if I'm harsh, it's because I love them. So with that being said, just making sure that you guys don't have to worry about me being biased. Let's get on with this thing. So, as we all know, the company LK Chen Swords, their niche, what they're right now focusing on, making Chinese swords as close to the originals as possible. We've seen this with their original set of swords, which they like to call the LK5, which were all based on Han Dynasty and True Kingdom designs. And they were based on antiques that LK Chen himself was able to get his hands on and examine, weigh them, test them, and stuff like that, and then make swords based on, on those particular models as close to the real things as possible, right down to how thin the blades were, how they were folded, as close as they possibly can. Because now it's modern times, you can't exactly recreate it exactly the same, but they got it as close to the real thing as possible. And they've been, with the later weapons and the later Dao they've been putting out, Dao meaning saber, of course, Jen meaning the straight swords, they've been trying to keep that same type of mindset, make them as close to the originals as possible. They also are known for picking models that aren't really overly embellished or are very decorative. Many times I happen to see in the Chinese market that's the typical quote unquote Tai Chi sword or Dao, whatever. They tend to have certain extra embellishments. They'll have certain carvings, in the handguards of dragons or phoenixes or Keelin or, tigers or whatever. And the LK Chen ones, for the most part, aren't like that. They tend to be pretty plain, while there will be some extra decorations in the scabbards that look really pretty, or there might be one or two particular models with a lot of extra decorations, like for instance the double dragon Suido that they sell, which is a lot more intricate because it was based on a model that supposedly somebody higher up in the military and nobility used. For the most part, they tend to have plainer pieces, and they tend to keep them at fairly cheaper prices than what you typically see. This particular piece has pretty much fallen in line with that particular mindset. As you can see, this is yet another no-nonsense sword that they are selling. And while there seems to be a little bit more extra embellishment in terms of like the lines that you happen to see on the fittings, for the most part, this is a pretty simplistic looking sword. And it is based on the type of weapon that a guardsman on the frontier during the Tang Dynasty would most likely be carrying. And they actually have an antique that they have based this on. You know, you can see on there, and this is pretty close to it. So let's get on to the specs for this thing, because I find the specs to this to be very interesting for a Tang Dao. Before I even get to the specifics of, like, you know, weight and length, let me just say that as far as Tang Dynasty Dao go, and for those of you who don't really know too much about it, a very brief history, usually when you look at Chinese military weapons, at first you happen to see dian, or straight swords, which are double-edged. Then toward the end of the Han Dynasty, we started seeing single-edged weapons, or Dao. And the Dao pretty much became the predominant sidearm, or a sword, that was used by the military in China, pretty much all the way up until the Qing Dynasty. There was a brief period of time when the dian kind of came back onto the battlefield, though the Dao was still the main weapon. But I think it was during the Ming Dynasty you started seeing it being sort of used in the military field again, probably more by generals or higher up in the military. But then by the Qing Dynasty, they pretty much, you know, went straight back to just using the Dao exclusively. Anyway, the Tang Dao is yet another straight-bladed, single-edged sword that was, you know, used by Chinese military and, you know, other people, other swordsmen. You didn't really see the curves happening until around the Sui Dynasty, or toward the end of the Tang Dynasty. And like I said, this is a typical example that you would usually see on the typical, you know, design that you would usually see during that time period. One thing that I did notice again is the fittings are much plainer than I typically see in the market for Tang Dao. Usually when I see examples of Tang Dao in the market, they tend to be, you know, with there's a certain, there's like two types of hand guards that I tend to see on them. They either, you know, I'll have them on the screen, but this is typically what I tend to see on the market pretty much. And it seems like almost every other Chinese forge is putting out some version of this. This has pretty much bucked that trend. You don't see a handguard like that at all. Instead, you get a very, you know, a much thinner one that almost looks like a tiny Japanese tsuba in a sense, like that, which is kind of fitting when you consider that the general belief is that the Tang Dao was pretty much implanted, like it was exported to Japan. Japanese swordsmiths liked the idea and pretty much took that to be the basis of what would later on be the katana. And you can kind of see that with this blade profile here, you know, with, you know, the blade geometry, the way the edge looks and all that. One interesting thing about the edge, however, which I find to be a little bit atypical, as well as the fittings a bit atypical from what you typically see for Tang Dao being sold, is the edge geometry itself. And I find this to be fascinating. Generally speaking, and I'm going to have to get another example here. I really wish I could bring the example up of the Tang Dao that Skull had gifted to me a while back. Unfortunately, it was stolen from me a couple of years ago, and so I can no longer present it. And God help the dude if I ever catch him. But I do have something close to it. And that's this pretty little number right here. The Double Dragon Suido. And if we look at the blade geometry here, and you look at how much surface area the edge takes up before the bevel comes in, and then you get kind of like the spine, you'll notice that the edge doesn't take up that much area on the blade. It's pretty much like just enough for the edge to cut, Then you get the bevel, and then you get most of the body being the heavier, flatter spine. And many Tang Dynasty Daos sold on the market, and indeed, the few examples that we happen to see that have survived, and a lot of them are in like Japanese museums, they pretty much have this edge profile. Like they have it pretty much like this. The difference being, of course, that the tip might be a little bit different, but as far as how much edge you get before the bevel hits, this is pretty much what you see. But this particular model, this Frontier Tang Dao, doesn't follow that example. Instead, what we get is something that's a lot closer to what we see with a quote-unquote typical Japanese katana, where the edge actually has a lot more surface area. It has a lot more, it takes up a lot more real estate on the blade. And the bevel is now further back. So now the spine is taking up less area. And that I find really interesting. There are examples of this in later pieces of Tang Dynasty Dao, but apparently not many. Which is why we happen to see that other design, I think. But it's still, I find it to be really cool that this particular piece has this, not only because it further distinguishes it from other ones on the market besides, the planar fittings, but also because this makes it easier to cut through targets. As I'll get into later, this thing cuts very well. Granted, at this point, we should kind of expect that from LK Chen as far as my experience is concerned, but this one really is insane as far as cutting goes. Now, the weight is, pretty good. It's pretty much 2 pounds. If you go to the website and you look at the specs there, pretty much states that, the blades go about 2 pounds. And that's pretty much the same for this particular piece that I had gotten. When I weighed it, it was pretty much 2 pounds with only a difference of 0.2 ounces. It was like 2 pounds, 0.2 ounces. 2 pounds. Which is, pretty good. It feels great in one hand, and it maneuvers very well in one hand, which I would expect for a sword like this, especially with that type of weight, and especially with the point of balance being about 5.5 inches from the handguard, which is also to be kind of expected from a sword like this. But in two hands, oh my god, this thing really sings in two hands. One-handed, it feels great. It feels fantastic in one hand. Just good enough. Like, very good, in fact. You could pretty much fence with this one-handed, no problems. But once you put two hands on it, it's just a beast because of that weight and, that really good balance to it, and the blade geometry and all that. The distal tapering is really good here at the base of the spine. It starts out at about like, I think, it's about like 30 millimeters, 29 millimeters, and then it gets to the tip at about 21 millimeters. So you got some really good distal tapering going on there. And you also have some very good profile tapering going on as well. Not as dramatic, but it's still there, which also lends very well to the balance and weight of the sword. The fittings are nice and tight on this. I didn't really have too much of a problem. As you can see there, even though the blade is overall rather utilitarian in its look, the fittings still have a certain elegance to them, what with the, extra lines that are kind of carved into the, the pommel and, excuse me, and into like, the fittings on the scabbard themselves. It's a rather interesting design, and again, it's not something that I typically see on, Tang Dao that's sold in the market, and it gives this a rather distinctive feel and a rather distinctive look as well. The fittings themselves are made from rose copper fittings. In the past, I think I made a mistake before when I said that certain things were brass or like bronze. This is definitely rose copper. I double checked with them, and the website happens to state that. And it's the same with, the end cap here, the handguard, straight up to the scabbard. And the scabbard itself is rosewood, I believe. So it doesn't smell like roses. But yeah, pretty hard, no cracks. no splits in it, anything like that. It's pretty much well put together. Everything is nice and tight. I didn't really have much of a problem with those. Although, I can't really say the same about the handguard. This, unfortunately, was a bit loose, which is a shame because when I first got it, it was pretty tight. But before I even started cutting with it, and I'm still not sure how it got loose, but it got loose. Not horribly so. Like, I really got to, like, shake it a bit for that to be there, but it's there. It's the only loose part, however. Everything else is pretty tight, and the blade itself, like, if I happen to, like, put my finger on this and shake this, the blade doesn't move. So it's just making me think that the gap must be here. And when I let them know about that, because, like, I kind of warn the companies when I see flaws saying, yo, I'm putting this in a review. They let me know that, I mean, they already told me, in fact, when I was unboxing this under the live unboxing, I was then sent an email saying that, by the way, this is a prototype and we're fixing a few things. So when I told them about this, they weren't really surprised, and they said that they had already handled that problem. So hopefully that means that anyone buying these, this should not be an issue. But considering that this is what I got, it would be, dishonest of me not to mention it. But as I said, this was a prototype, and this is one of the things that they were working out. So this should, presumably according to them, not be an issue. Everything else is nice and tight, though. There was no problems with the fittings in the scabbard, and no problem with the other fittings on here are pretty good. We also happen to have this lanyard here, which it seems to me is there to kind of like keep your hand from falling off the blade. In fact, I have noticed that with other swords, when LK Chen is practicing with them, he, at least with one sword I saw him practicing with, he had put that right there to keep his hand tight on it. So I'm pretty sure that that's what this is for. And I noticed that considering that this has no extra tassels or pretty things on it, I'm pretty sure that is what this is for. So there you go. So now we need to talk a little bit about the blade itself. I've already mentioned that this particular piece has a lot more blade presence. Like, the bevel is further back from the edge, which really helps it with the cut. Also, the fact that this is not, an overly heavy sword makes it very quick and light and maneuverable. I pretty much can get this wherever I want. But the blade itself, and I really need to get into this before I really start talking about its cutting ability. The blade itself is made out of, and I'm not surprised because this seems to be their favorite steels to work with, 1065 carbon steel mixed with T8 tungsten-cobalt-vanadium tool steel, or high-speed tool steel. And it's pattern folded, a folded pattern steel, which is pretty much all of their blades. So once again, you get a really beautiful pattern in the blade. However, they also differentially heat treated this one as well. They didn't do that with their other swords, but they did that with this one. So that means that this blade, in ironic, weird sort of funny kind of way, is made very similarly to a katana, where it's it's made out of folded steel and is differentially heat treated, which means that the edge is going to be harder than the spine. That's good, right? Yes, it is. However, and this is something that a lot of people don't seem to understand when it comes to how you make blades and the type of steels you use and how you heat treat it. That also means that this is not exactly a blade that I would give to a beginner for cutting practice. The reason why is blades like this are prone to taking a set from a really bad cut. Now, this does not mean that the sword is bad. In fact, I have tested it before with a flex test, doing a bit of a destructive test, and it was able to pretty much do that with, no problems. It stayed true. It stayed straight. But it has been shown, even historically, with even like certain people who happen to have some really old swords and they were doing test cutting with them, Japanese swords, that those made in this traditional manner are more prone to taking a set, i.e. bending, if your cut isn't good, if your edge alignment isn't right, or if you happen to hit a really hard object wrongly, like you kind of messed up your cut and ended up hitting something unexpectedly, you might end up with, you might end up with a bent edge or slightly rolled edge or a bent blade. Doesn't mean you can't bend it back true. You can, but this is something that could happen. And this is something that tends to happen with patterned steel blades anyway. This is just the nature of the beast. There are a lot of people out there these days who think that the minute a blade takes a set, or if the edge rolls a bit, that automatically means that the blade is bad. And while that can be a sign of a bad heat treat, you also have to look at how the blade was made, what types of steels were used, and whether or not it's monosteel. And usually, if it's not monosteel, you're already taking a risk that the thing might take a bend from a bad cut. People don't seem to get that, which frustrates the hell out of me. Especially when you consider that many times we start seeing these bends and these sets and these rolled edges from destructive tests. They're called destructive tests for a reason, because you're using the blade in a way that is meant to kind of destroy it, not preserve it, and not in its intended purpose. So that being said, and as I'll show in the footage later, if you're cutting with this thing normally and you're cutting through targets that it was meant to cut through, there's not going to be a problem. The problem would happen is if I was cutting through regular targets and I would see it taking a set or have a rolled edge or something like that. If I'm doing an abusive test to make a messed up cut, that stuff's going to happen. Seriously, if you want a sword that is the least prone to taking a set from a bad cut, and or if you're a beginner that doesn't really know how to cut properly at first, and you just need looking for a really good beater type sword, then that means you're looking for a monosteel blade. Yes, they're not as pretty as a pattern steel sword, pattern wielded steel sword, or a differentially hardened sword where you get the nice beautiful hamon and the pattern steel and all that type of stuff. True, but the sword's going to be able to take a lot more abuse because it's not made out of folded steel, which and especially if it's differentially heat treated, that means a part of it's going to be softer than the hardened part, and that there is going to be causing some freaky things to happen to the blade when the shot goes through it. You're going to want pretty much a monosteel, and the best monosteel ones I've seen that can really take a lot of abuse is something made out of 9260 steel. If you got a blade made out of that, that's going to take a hell of a lot of abuse. This, considering the steels that are in it, 1065 carbon steel plus a mix of T8 tool, it's amazing to me that it's able to take the amount of abuse that it can. So yeah, it's not a bad thing in any sense, but I just need to stress that if you're somebody who's not very good with edge alignment, chances are if you're using this, you're going to end up taking a set, and it ain't the blade's fault, it's yours. So just stating that. But it is pretty, again, if you want a pretty looking blade, you can't go wrong with this. Again, you see those really beautiful patterns in the blade, and because it is differentially heat treated, it actually does have a natural hamon. And it actually looks really nice. It's very subtle, but it's there. And it's really pretty the way it comes out into the light. So enough of that. How about how it cuts? How well does it cut? Well, let's look at the footage and find out. So as you can see here, I'm showing that the sword can easily be used with one hand because of its balance and weight. However, I'm going to be using two-handed cuts as well as one-handed cuts, since it seems to me that the sword was made for two hands. So here, I'm going to be making a rather precise, very controlled cut. And as you can see, you don't really need that much power in order to cut cleanly through the target. That was a nice hard bottle, and it was a really nice smooth cut. However, this one I'm going to be using a more powered swing, just to show that when you do decide to power right through it, again, it will cut through really cleanly, hardly any resistance. But I was also testing to see how well it would do in case the cut was a bit off, because I know I'm not the greatest, cutter in the world, and again, that was a one-handed swing. So I was also kind of testing if the cut was a bit sloppy, which again, I need to work on my form, so it's a very easy way to test it if it could deal with sloppy cuts. Get a nice one-handed cut there, smooth one. But yeah, I was showing that even with that, it would work. You don't have to worry about it taking a set as long as you're cutting through standard targets. There was a bit more of a controlled one-handed cut, and it went through. Now I was trying to be really careful here because I felt, maybe I should have done it anyway, but if I had cut deeply into the cutting stand or overswung and hit the ground really hard or something, then I get the feeling that it might have taken a set or bent or something. But I didn't really want to push it. But as long as you're cutting through standard targets, and hard, even if it's a bit hard, as long as like a standard target that the sword's meant to cut through, it should cut through pretty well. That was a particularly hard bottle there, and again, cut through nicely, pretty clean. That's probably my favorite cut. It was nicely executed in my opinion. And then I sliced the top off of it there, and then cut through the rest. And again, it just easily did it. Hardly any problems with that at all. Again, going for another two-handed cut, went through quite well. The blade does really well. This, despite the rather thin profile of the edge, and the different mix of steels and the differential hardening, it doesn't mess with its resilience. So as long as I'm not doing anything ridiculous or twisting too much or cutting into something like the 2x4, it should be fine. So, and also here you're going to notice right as I put the blade in that I was testing the handguard because I was trying to see if it got any looser than how it started. And it didn't, which was good. So overall, it held up quite well with the cutting tests. Alright, so as you can see, it cuts very well. Wish I had tatami, but I had to work with what I had to work with, and I made sure to actually use hard bottles because I wanted it to have a tough target tough enough target to get through. And the edge was fine, the blade was fine. It was able to put up with, the rigors of cutting with hardly any problems. No problems really. And I just cleaned the blade, and that was that. Though, once again, that blade was really, really sharp. As I accidentally found out while cleaning the blade, that was my own dumbass fault for having my thumb a little bit too close to the edge as I was wiping stuff away and re-oiling it. But yeah, this thing is ridiculously sharp. Some people were making fun of me when I did the whole, or at least laughing at me when I was doing the whole imagining somebody like going insane sharpening the edge. Well, there's a reason why. These blades tend to be super sharp. So my overall verdict, I like it. I really, really like it. I like the fact that it's different from other Tang Dao in the market. It differentiates itself in its look, in its simplicity. There's still a beauty to it. There's just enough simplicity so it doesn't feel embellished, but at the same time, because it uses the rose copper fittings and the way the fittings themselves are designed with the lines that happen to be in it, it gives us a very distinctive look. I like the weight and balance of it. It handles like a dream. The fittings on the handguard could be better. Again, you get that very slight rattle going on here. It's not horrible, but it's there. It doesn't move up and down. It moves side to side. But I was told that they had already fixed that. Like, all the new ones coming out don't have that issue. I hope they're right, but it should be mentioned that that was there. So, yeah. This was a prototype, so I will put that out there. But overall, it's a great piece. Would I recommend it? Yes, but with a caveat. If you plan on doing cutting with it, keep in mind that I would not recommend this particular blade for a beginner. In fact, quite frankly, and to be honest, I've always felt that LK Chen swords are specialty swords. They're made for people who've already had some experience with Chinese weapons. For one thing, they're not made in the typical way that you normally find Chinese martial arts weapons to be. Most Chinese straight swords tend to be based on Ming and Qing varieties. Same thing with a lot of Dao in the market, with the few exceptions being like Tang Dao or Han Dao, because they have a very distinct look and because of like national pride and all that type of stuff. So, they tend, most stuff on the market that people train with have a distinctive look, a distinctive feel, a distinctive weight, length. LK Chen swords kind of buck that trend a bit in that they're more concerned with recreating existing antiques and not just simply trying to chase a market with what's already out there. Because of that, you kind of have to know your way around swords and be comfortable around them to get used to how differently these tend to feel and tend to look. Like, again, with their straight swords, the handguards tend to be really, really small, so that might affect your form a little bit. The blades tend to be a bit longer than you normally see with one-handed swords, especially if you're going with their Han Dao. Their Han Dao are really long. If you're not used to that, that might throw you off, which is why I've always said, with some caveats, I recommend them because they're great swords. But depending on what you're used to, they may throw you off. Now this one, once again, I kind of find myself feeling that way, but in the sense that since this is a pattern wielded, differentially hardened heat treated sword, I really feel that you need to have some idea of what you're doing with cutting practice if you plan on buying this for a sword, that you plan on cutting with. If you're planning on buying this because you want to cut through targets, you want to cut through tatami, but you are not very good at cutting, yeah, understand that you're getting a weapon that may bend on you if you screw up. Or if you're going to be like, oh, I want to see if I can hack through trees with it. It's probably going to take a set. Doesn't mean that it's going to stay permanently that way. You'll probably bend it back, but that's something that can happen. Same thing with having a rolled edge. These things can happen with pattern wielded blades. It's just the nature of how they're made. Again, you're going to want something made out of 9260 steel, mono steel all the way through, if you want something that's going to put up with the, BS swinging or hacking at things that you're not really supposed to be hacking with. So, yeah, this, I would recommend it for a serious practitioner, for somebody who's pretty decent at cutting, and even if you're just a backyard cutter who wants something fairly cool to, work with, and you have some semblance of skill with your cutting, like you can keep your edge aligned, yeah, this is a good piece to have. It's at a good price. It's very utilitarian looking. It almost has you can almost mistake this for like a modern tactical sword, actually, which is another thing I like about it. So, yeah, for its price range and for the quality of the steel and how it's put together, I think this is another really good piece that, somebody interested in blades like this will enjoy. So, with that being said, I hope you guys got something out of the review. Once again, I thank LK Chen for sending this piece to me for review. And I hope that, my reviews, as usual, help you guys to make an informed decisions in your purchase, as well as helping the company to improve their line of weaponry. So, that being said, hope you guys have a good one. Catch you guys later.